How's it going today, folks? I'm Carter of Locally Sourced. Today, my guest is Jon Kiper. He is a musician, an author, restaurateur, and he is a current independent candidate for governor of New Hampshire. John, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
of course. It's a pleasure to have you. I guess we'll just dive right in.
Yeah.
Before we get into like some of the deeper policy stuff, I want to kind of address the nature by which you've chosen to run independently as opposed to with the Democratic Party. You've said that if Ray Buckley wasn't the chair of the Democratic Party, then you would be running as a Democrat. And I think for people that aren't as familiar with like the inside baseball of the New Hampshire Democratic Party, I'd like to kind of take a moment to familiarize people with Ray Buckley and his position with the Democratic Party and why specifically they're so obstinate when it comes to addressing the concerns of the progressive left in the state of New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think it's also not just the progressive left. I think it's a lot of basically the rank and file people on the ground that are doing the door knocking and the phone calling, the text messaging, doing the work. It's just a frustration. So just to go back, um, the New Hampshire Democratic Party has been run by Ray Buckley for about the last 15 years, and basically in those 15 years we have seen a steady decline of democratic enrollment in the state. And the weird thing for me, and I think it's a weird thing for most people that are involved in democratic politics, is that somehow we win the federal races. We've got Maggie Hassan, Jean Shaheen, Chris Pappas, Maggie Goodlander going to DC as Democrats, yet the whole state government is run by Republicans. And I think it's this, if we were a totally red state, I don't think anyone would have any criticisms to say of red. They'd just say it's a red state. This is what it is. But it's such a, really a it's just so hard to understand. I mean, it just doesn't even make any sense how this could possibly happen, that we would have these votes being so different. Um, like it just kind of boggles the mind. And it was one of the reasons I got into running, is I really wanted to find out like what's going on behind the scenes that would be making this sort of really bizarre voting pattern happen. And I can't really nail down any one thing specifically, except that it seems like the federal races are dominating the way that we campaign because they bring in more money. And it's the same problem that the party has nationally, where they focus so much on fundraising that they've sort of forgotten what the fundraising is for. And one thing I've heard about Ray is that he is good at fundraising, and he's been doing it for so long. He has a lot of connections with the donors and in DC. But people just don't understand how it's possible that we could lose, so many races. I mean, it does have to do with gerrymandering, but again, they knew in 2020 that the redistricting was going to happen, after the census, and that was a really crucial election to win, and we lost. And so for me, it's not even necessarily about race specifically, even though maybe I've talked about it like that in the past. It's just the idea that if any organization, even if it was the Red Sox or the Nike Corporation, was having such a downward trend, they would change the management, just to show people like, hey, we're listening to you. You're aggravated. We are going to have a new CEO or a new head. And I think that's really the issue. And so I ran for chair of the Democratic Party in was that February? Yeah, and I only did it because no one else, when I looked into it like 3 days before the filing period was supposed to, and no one else was running. And I thought, guys, this is crazy. Like, we can't have so many people afraid to challenge the leadership after so many failures. But people were scared, and I talked to people, and they just didn't want to challenge his leadership. The way that the vote happens is pretty ugly, in the sense that there's about 280 people that can vote for who the chair is. and it's basically a lot of formerly elected Senate, former governors are Democrats, former executive counselors, um, and then a group of just it's sort of really random who gets to vote for him. But a lot of those people, at least some of those people, are on the New Hampshire Democratic Party's payroll. And so, and the vote is public as well. So, and this is not even New Hampshire's democratic rules. This is actually national rules that the vote has to be public. Apparently, that's what he said. So as a result, people don't want to vote against their boss or their leader because it's going to be public, and they know that if they vote against him and he wins, there's going to be retribution, and there has been. Emmett Saldati ran for Ray's position. Was that leading into 2020? I think it was. And he lost, and there was some blowback against the people who voted for him because it was public. So that was one of my frustrations, was that it seemed to me that the Democratic leadership wasn't even wasn't attracting enough leaders, that there was even anyone to challenge, the leadership that was failing. That was frustrating in itself. And then you see this attitude of the candidates that I did not have, which was the attitude of the Democratic Party, the leadership is wait your turn and earn your keep. Meaning you need to spend 10 or 20 years with us knocking doors and making phone calls, and you also need to be able to raise money. And that's really what seemed to me to be the values that they were looking for in candidates. And I get it to a degree that if I come in, right, and I've never done any work for the party, I've done a little bit, I worked for Buttigieg's campaign for a bit. I've done minimal work, but I haven't been there for decades, in every meeting. And for me to come in and try to run as governor would sort of, and if I was to win, would sort of, eliminate the leadership as gatekeepers as to who can win or who can run, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
so I was frustrated when I was running for governor. And to be fair, Ray was actually very open. Once he got to know me after the first event we did, he sat me down and said, hey, this is the people that you really should talk to in the party. If you have any problems getting into any town or county meetings, just let me know. They have to let you in, basically. They have to let you speak. Even if the chair of that town has already endorsed one of your opponents, they have to let you in. So he was helpful. And I don't want to criticize Ray to say that he's not brought anything to the Democratic Party, because obviously we've won these DC races. But in my opinion, I think many people in the state, I would rather have a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature and maybe a Republicans going to DC if we had to flip it, because just the people in our state government are making way more decisions that impact our everyday life. I mean, they're just not getting a lot done in Congress right now,
Right.
So I think that really sums it up, is just a frustration with this, whatever technique it is that they're doing with the campaigning that's causing us to lose statewide and win the federal races. There's a frustration with that. And then there's a general frustration with the town and county leadership that there wasn't enough communication, not enough sort of coordination with the state. And I felt that frustration too, which is, pretty much, I initially decided to run as an independent like the day after the primary when I lost. And I thought, I don't have any chance of getting through a Democratic primary, because there's always going to be someone that's better liked by the party and has more money than me, because there's just so many people that are lawyers and lobbyists and
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we saw a good example of this when Steve Marchand ran for governor in 2018, right? There was a lot of just major shutout for him from the state party side of things when he was running against Molly Kelly in that primary. And they just kind of they really let him fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's kind of funny talking to Steve, because he says, and he and other people thought he was going to win. There was a vibe that he assumed he was going to win, and just the people that turned out were not his people. And this is just a kind of a really weird thing about the primary is And I think people got to really think about this because it really is a bigger impact than I had thought initially, which is the dates, the beginning of September. So you've just gone through the whole summer where families are gone, they're not around, people are then getting back into school mode. Like no one is thinking about the governor's race. No one is thinking about politics at all until literally like 3 weeks before. So it really is a huge factor in who shows up. And that's where it's really tough because who is going to show up is older folks, um, and people that are really dedicated to the party, and they're just more likely to vote for a party insider because it's just kind of who they think is going to win, and it's hard to convince these people, hey, you've been wrong 5 times in a row. Like maybe
Yeah.
think differently. And it was so funny because I went, the first big event I did last time was the Shaheen McIntyre dinner. And I got up there and I gave my spiel, and it was basically, hey, if we want to win, we got to get independent voters to vote. And they are generally younger people, they're working class people, and they need to hear simple messages like weed for housing, like these simple ideas. Everyone wants, not everyone, a lot of people want weed legalized, and most people want housing to be more affordable. So it's a no brainer. And it was so funny because I gave this speech, and everyone else that was talking, every senator that got up there, every one of the representatives basically were just railing on the Republicans the whole time. It was just like Republicans bad, abortion, Republicans bad. And a couple people came up to me and they were like, you're the only one that was actually talking about like strategy and how to win, and not just trying to like fire up the base with rhetoric, and just having an actual like numbers based approach, like knowing how this works. And it was refreshing to hear it from some of the people. And then it was kind of also refreshing to see the other campaigns beginning to lean into my ideas of housing and cannabis and these other issues.
And that was kind of
Um,
your goal, right? Like to push the candidates to actually adopt some of the policies and positions that you were trying to espouse essentially, so that, it's like even if you didn't have the political capital, for lack of a better term, to yield a win in the race, at the very least you were kind of pushing the candidates to do something a little bit more effective for just regular working class people.
yeah, and I think that that's something that everyone should take away from my run, was that you can have an impact without winning, but you have got to have a goal. You have to have tiered sort of goals. And, obviously my first one is always winning, but the second one is, okay, if I can't win, I want to move the Overton window into a situation where the things that I'm talking about and I want to be talking about are the things that the other candidates are talking about too. And and I was really successful at that. I mean, it was crazy the first time we were at an event, and I had this line about housing where I said, one of the things that we need to do is educate planning and zoning boards as to just the numbers about how we need more housing, why we need more housing. Because I mean, to be honest, a lot of the people on ZBA, I've been on the ZBA and on the planning board. You have some people that are coming from the real estate world and some people coming from construction world, but some people that are just doing it because there's a vacancy on the board and somebody asked them to be on it. So maybe they don't have the background to really address these issues. And I've heard people on the
Right.
ZBA even say that, like, I don't really know what we're talking about right now. So
Yeah.
my thought was, educate them and just say, hey, this is why we need this type of housing, and maybe it would improve their decision making. And it's a great line because, one, who knows if it's going to work? I mean, I think it would work, but it might not. But also, it's free. It's basically free. It's a good solution. And we were at this event, and Cindy Warmington started saying that, and I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." I'm like, "Oh, that was my idea,
Yeah.
directly off of
Oh,
my."
wonder where that came from, right? Yeah.
So I was thrilled. I mean, that was kind of the just the best part of the campaign was those moments. But it was definitely it's a bittersweet thing where you do all this work, and obviously you want to win, but again, there are secondary goals that can be achieved. And as long as you can really get on the debate stage, was the goal of mine the whole time. And once I did that, that kind of really opened up the doors to, I mean, a lot of our vote, I think, what I heard anecdotally, a lot of the people that voted for me said it was because of my performance in the debate stage.
Yeah, and so we've touched on a couple different things here, and we'll sort of circle back around to each of those points because we're just going through a lot of different issues here. I want to sort of reel back a little bit to the concept of organizing and planning. So you brought up a really good point about sort of like just people being checked out over the summer because they're doing other stuff, and then you've got 3 weeks before the actual election, right? So this always is something I'm pretty like devoted to in terms of effectively communicating to people is this notion of like really getting into the weeds and understanding sort of the nuances and specifics when it comes to the actual organizing that needs to occur. Now, like I referenced earlier, Steve Marchand's campaign in 2018. Now, I actually worked on that campaign to a certain degree. I was doing ads for him. I like a lot of the sort of Facebook ads that we were putting out. Like I had gone out to his stump speeches and cut those for him. Um, and something that I remember being, just sort of like a clear bottleneck for them was that Steve really had this solid agenda of going around and sort of knocking on doors and getting out to people, but the problem was the staffing, right? Now, I like to draw a parallel to sort of what's happening in New York City with Zohran Mamdani, right? You've got a lot of very, very condensed housing, right? You can send door knockers into an apartment building, you can hit hundreds of people all in one go. And we don't have that luxury here in New Hampshire. To do something that hits the same number of people, you're talking about staffing expenses, you're talking about gas prices, you're talking about wear and tear on vehicles. So it simply doesn't work in the same way. Now, I think you have a really great strategy where you're utilizing TikTok and social media to reach out to people, which was something that we found on Steve's campaign was fairly effective, right? We were able to get some of those view counts up into the 10, 15,000 type of plays. But again, that wasn't really enough to sort of like crack through the shell to make a really widespread appeal. Now, things may have changed since then. Obviously, we're talking about, it's what, 7 years later. So the proliferation of digital media in terms of it being able to touch people for political interest has changed. And I think that's something worth noting and addressing. But it doesn't change the fact that on the ground, when it comes to really getting to people that are sort of just politically disengaged, who are focused on like going up to Winnipesaukee and, like running their boats or having a good summer, right? That probably are just trying to check out as much as possible, especially when just like everything that's happening nationally right now is just like an absolute headache. And I think there's probably a lot of people that are just trying to find a way to escape the like hyper politicization of just about everything in the country right now. So my sort of question here is like as an independent who doesn't necessarily have that like financial institutional backing from the Democratic Party, which has like a long history of of doing this, connections that go all the way deep into DC. You're out here, you're trying to start a new party, functionally. And I'm sort of curious when you look at sort of those challenges that you're facing in terms of really getting into that nitty-gritty, what's your take on the strategies to really kind of leverage uh reaching sort of disconnected, depoliticized voters, people that like may very well find progressive policies to be attractive, identify as independents, might be easily swayed by Republican talking points because they're really good, as again, as you've pointed out, sort of like shortening things down into catchphrases, right? Like they're really, really effective at sort of like abbreviating things and getting them out there to people. And I think Democrats and especially leftists are really bad at that. And they always want to sort of explain things to people in paragraphs, if not pages.
Yeah.
And pointing to academic institutions and a lot of data, which usually just makes regular working class people just check out, and it's frustrating for them. So I'm sort of curious how you plan to sort of thread that needle.
Yeah, I think it is funny, particularly. I find one very ineffective argument is when I'm either debating with someone or I see somebody making a video and they say, you got to read these 10 books and then come back to me. And it's like, man, I didn't come on here for a book assignment. And like most people aren't reading regularly. Like if you can't give me the the notes on that, then this discussion is kind of over. But I think right now we are actually probably in one of the more difficult times, maybe ever, to disseminate a message of political nature. And one of the issues we ran into at the beginning of the last campaign, or shortly after we'd begun, is Facebook stopped promoting political content pages to anyone that wasn't already following that page. And so we immediately saw a drop in our website views it went from like 150 a day to like 30, like overnight. And but it was just only really hurting new politicians, because if you're Bernie Sanders, you already got 1 million or 2 million followers on Facebook. It didn't hurt you. But if you were a new upstart like us, it really hurt you. And then just even trying to run Facebook ads, I had to do a bunch of back end stuff proving that we are a legitimate campaign. And every once in a while, an ad would just get taken down for no reason. I had some problems with Google. I couldn't run YouTube ads because I tried to at one point. I didn't have the paperwork right. They flagged me as being like a, disinformation campaign. And I could never get through to anyone to even run ads on Google because it was like the black hole of customer service.
Yeah.
So you got that whole issue. And then like one of the funniest parts was I was, adamant the whole time. I'm like, I got to get on WMUR. Once I'm on TV, this whole thing that I'm doing will be legitimate, and then people will see me as a legitimate candidate. And I got on WMUR and I was so excited, did my interview with Adam Sexton or whatever. And the next day, these kids came into my restaurant. I say kids, they were like in their 20s. Some guys I knew they were in a band and they were coming in. We're talking about their band, had a show coming up. And I said, hey, I was on TV last night. I was on WMUR. Did you guys hear about that? And they were like, what's WMUR? I was like,
priceless.
oh my God. And then even people like, I don't have a TV that I can just turn on WMUR. I don't. Like, I'll see the clips on YouTube, or I'll see them on Facebook or something, or I'll post them there. But like, I don't watch live TV. I don't know very many people that actually do, aside from like my parents and their generation.
Right.
So we've got this problem where people over the age of, let's say, 50 are getting a lot of news from WMUR, and maybe they're still reading newspapers. You've got, people, really young people and really old people, like using YouTube a lot. And then you've got sort of very, sort of 40 to 70 using Facebook. And then Instagram is kind of like, let's say 25 to 50. And then TikTok is like 18 to maybe 45, but it's kind of come to this world, I think, where most people are really only using one form of social media. Like, I don't watch a lot of YouTube. I don't watch a lot of Instagram. I don't really mess with Facebook that much, but I'll watch videos on TikTok. And I think there's people that, have picked their social media apparatus, if you will. And so that's kind of the hardest part, where running TV ads is only going to get 20% of the people. Running Facebook ads is only going to get maybe 20 or 30%. Running TikTok ads, which you can't even do for politics, is only going to hit another group. So, and the funny thing too is like what I have found is what I'll put on TikTok, I'll do the edgier stuff. I'll do stuff that like is a little bit more casual, and then I'll clean it up for Facebook and Instagram, knowing that that's so. TikTok is where you go to get more followers. You're not really going to get more followers on Meta because of the way that they've sort of siloed this the political stuff. But you've got to go to Meta to sort of grow, like, and to sort of feed that garden of followers that you have there, if you will, or communicate with those people. And like I've found, it's a lot more effective for me to post stuff on my personal Facebook feed as opposed to the governor's page, because the governor's page, or Jon Kiper for governor, just doesn't get as much traction. It just doesn't get as much, doesn't hit the algorithm, because they want you to
that kind
buy
of tracks.
ads. And because they want you to buy the ads, so they sort of
Right.
have taken the pages, and they're not. And I found this with my restaurant too, where we were getting basically no traction if we weren't paying for ads on Instagram and Facebook. So the world is just really, a strange place. And honestly, I don't even know really how we're going to get the people who are on zero social media, don't watch WMUR, don't read newspapers, who have totally checked out, like you're talking about. And that's, a good chunk of people. And so, like in terms of door knocking, we did a very limited amount of door knocking just because we had a couple volunteers that were willing to do it, and we mainly did it in Manchester because you could hit the houses pretty quickly.
Right.
I'm skeptical that the input output of knocking doors in really rural areas makes a lot of sense. But I'm sure there's people that will argue the other way. Um, but it is just extremely time consuming to drive down a mile long dirt road to go to one house. um, and is there a better way to get out there? I mean, that's one thing that I was trying to push our team to do, was what I call sort of like digital door knocking,
Yeah.
where you're going into the comments section of a Facebook post and really like talking to the people in there that are they're basically being critical and saying like, well, what's your issue?
Sure.
Especially the Republicans. And I've had people, I've been able to sort of, through a series of conversations or comments on Facebook, get people to at least open up to the idea of voting for a Democrat. And usually it was me having to say, I'm not going to ban your guns.
Yeah.
And, we're all getting screwed by big corporations. And,
Right.
and that would, people would be like, oh, cool. Like you're not a lobbyist for Purdue Pharma. All right. You're not a lawyer. You're not one of these people that's sort of screwing me in your private life and then coming here in politics and saying, oh no, I'm the good guy, I'm here to help you. And it's like, well, you know everything you've been doing in your private life would say that you've been sort of screwing me, or screwing
Yeah.
my type of people, with your with how you've been running, your private life. So there's like um this misalignment of just goals, I think. And that's where I think that I did well, was just because people trusted me, because I'm straight there in the economic battle. I'm not this rich lawyer who's
Right.
looking down and saying, "Oh, we need to help these poor peasants." Because what happens is, we keep voting for rich people to solve poor people's problems, and then they somehow don't, and then they just go, "Oh,
Yeah.
they go, oh, well, we couldn't get minimum wage through, or we don't have Medicare for all, we don't have, good schools or whatever, but I guess we'll try again next time. But for me, it's like, if we don't have affordable housing, I'm stuck in this 700 square foot apartment. If we don't have
Right.
good schools, my kid's not going to college. If we don't have lower property taxes, like that was one of the biggest hurdles for me running my business, was every 6 months getting a $4,000 bill from the town and being like, oh, remember that money that I thought, the profit that I thought I made in my restaurant? Like, no, I
Yeah, it's
didn't.
gone.
And so that's kind of where I think I will be a more effective governor, because it's just, I need these things for me. Like, it's selfish in a way. It's like, and I think people got to look at the motivations behind their politicians. And like, I hate to say it, because I know a lot of Democrats' hearts are in the right place. But when I sort of am with them and on the campaign trail, I don't know why they're running. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So
what's your motivation? What are you doing here?
and I think that you're actually kind of we're sort of walking a line that I think is really interesting, right? Where we're talking about the idea of like being self-serving in a sense. And I think there's a strange I'm fascinated by sociology, right? And I think there's an C. Wright Mills talks about this in a book called The Sociological Imagination, where he talks about the sort of disconnect between the self and the community. And I think there's something kind of fascinating there where we've sort of done a really, really effective job in this country of breaking down the connection between the individual and the group. And I think, to the sort of point about maybe why things have fallen apart with the Democratic Party is that I think the thing that plagues them is very similar to the thing that plagues the Republicans, which is essentially this idea of like, I've got mine and I'm going to pull up the ladder. Um, and I think sort of there's a way to explain to people that like you can actually serve yourself and your individuality best by focusing your attention on lifting the tides to raise all boats, right? And I think this is what I find fascinating about your platform, is this notion of like, yes, it's self-serving, but it actually serves everybody individually at the same time. And that seems to me to be a huge part of the breakdown that occurs with this. And I actually think that's a really good way to connect with people, especially if like talking about sort of the Christian voter, right? I feel like there's a really solid opening here to appeal to sort of a more like um uh religious impulse to sort of say help folks, right?
Yeah,
That I feel like the conservatives really like miss the mark and sort of twist and conform or distort rather contort or distort that notion into a way that ends up sort of like uh causing the lower half of people to fight against each other so that they can sort of like take the bag and run.
yeah,
And I think that the Democratic Party has really kind of like, whether they're conscious of it or not, ended up doing basically the same thing. And I think that that's sort of one of the things that really strikes at the heart of the problem when you come at it as an independent, is to say, no, like this is the actual sort of continuous issue that goes from one party to the other and makes them functionally uniparty.
yeah,
And so I always am fascinated by somebody who's trying to appeal to this notion of like, no, you can kind of do both. You just have to sort of flip the way you're looking at the silhouette, if that's it makes sense. So I'm just sort of like, and I don't, I'm trying to find a way to turn this into a question, but I really think that like this is a fascinating dynamic, and I always think that there's a way to approach this. Like I, as someone who's very much so staunchly on the left, I a critique I have for a lot of people on the left who want to sort of like hone in on identity politics and focus on sort of like the characteristics that make us who we are. It's like, yeah, but you're kind of overlooking the fact that regardless of your gender or your race or your, sort of like whatever identity parameters you use to sort of categorize yourself, right? We're all workers. And at the end of the day, that might be the best way to unite some sort of broader concept of how to uh, sort of collectively advocate for things that help each of us as individuals, right? The idea that, well, if we raise the taxes on the wealthiest members of the state, which, like, I think it's worth pointing out that right now we are functionally sort of a tax haven, right? And I think a lot of wealthy people from other states look at New Hampshire and they're like, wow, it's kind of like Florida, except it's a little less cooked and there's like less crime, right? You know what I mean? Like they sort of see all the wonderful things about Florida and they get to have that sort of like old-timey Yankee New England vibe, and they can live in their little house on the lake and have a nice long private driveway and be totally insulated and not have to sweat anything. And so you get a lot of really, really big, super wealthy sort of CEOs or like upper management people that are trying to buy property here and basically use it as a way to sort of protect their nest egg. And that really screws over the working class in New Hampshire. And I mean, I think as a restaurateur, that when you denigrate younger people, wage workers, you're making it so that the availability of things like restaurants sort of peters out. And it makes it a lot harder for those places to exist, which is ultimately going to kill the communities and undermine exactly like many of the reasons why these people would move here in the first place. So I'm sort of wondering what your take on that assertion is.
yeah. I mean, it's 100% true. This state is a tax haven. There's no way around that. And one of the ironies I think about Kelly Ayott's campaign is she's saying that Democrats are going to mass up, or Massachusetts, make New Hampshire into Massachusetts because of our leftist policies. But the reality is, it's the Republicans, uh, you know, tax or lack of tax policy, and their sort of lack of policy on housing and zoning and planning in terms of allowing family style homes to be built, that has put us in a situation where you have $700,000 duplexes in my town that no one in Newmarket is going to buy. And I met the people that bought them, and they're from Massachusetts. And so you have to be making a Boston based pay to buy a new home in a lot of areas in New Hampshire. So people from Massachusetts are doing that. And then, like you said, you have people moving here for the simple reason that they don't want to pay a lot of taxes. And that's just not really the kind of neighbors you want. When what I look at taxation as in a lot of these is investing in our community, in our schools, into our downtowns, and making our state better. And these people fundamentally are moving here because they don't want to invest in anyone else's community aside from their own immediate, needs. And it's just not a great way to run a state. And I mean, going back to what you were saying at the very beginning, I grew up going to a Christian church, and I was always sort of flabbergasted by the amount of money that the church had and what seemed like it was not doing enough for the poor people in the Seacoast area. Now, they did do some things, and some people would argue they do a lot, but it always seemed to me as a little bit confusing to be hearing about, not being rich and then seeing all the BMWs in the parking lot. And I thought of this I think when Bernie was running the last time, he's talking about socialism and stuff. And I at one point I thought, shut up about socialism and just say, hey, it's the good Christian thing to do. Like, this is a Christian nation, right? Like, be Christ-like and welcome the stranger and feed the hungry and clothe the needy and do all these things. Love your neighbor like yourself. Like,
use the old Jewish guy to advocate for Christian Christian points.
I know,
It's
right?
very you really really good cracking into that sort of Zionist impulse there.
Yeah, right. I know it was wishful thinking, but and it's kind of funny because a lot of people on the left are atheists or agnostics, and I sort of want to like slap in the face and go, hey, these people on the other side are saying they're Christians. Let's just push them to do the good Christian things that they claim to be, in favor of. And that's like really the best argument in my mind with the Christian right, and how you can sort of use very easy language in the Bible and just say, look, you guys are clearly not following your own religion, So I think it's really important, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, to message to these people who are not traditional voters or independents that are not voting all the time, and to get them on the same page and get all of us on the same page that it's like, hey, if we want to tax the rich, we can at any time, because simply we have the numbers. It's democracy. There's more of us than there are of them. And we could, I figured this out. This is just back of the envelope calculation, but a 1% tax on people making over $250,000 a year would be $150 million per year. And that would only cost each one of these families between $3,000 and $5,000. Like, we're not talking about them each having to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars. Like, the tax would not be that much, but it would be substantial in aggregate. There's this argument that, and this is one of the cool things about using social media that I have found, is it can be like a little focus group. So I'll put out a message or a video on YouTube or TikTok or social or Meta, and you can look at the comments and find out what the arguments are going to be from the Republicans. And then sometimes people on the left will give you the arguments against it. And like, for instance, I made this post about taxing the rich, and a bunch, not a bunch, but a few Republicans came in and say, oh, then the rich will just take their money and leave, and we'll lose, all that, whatever they're providing us now. And It was really funny because people in the comments said, hey, Massachusetts implemented a wealth tax and they did not leave. And when I ended up researching it, I found that they studied this a lot, and people just don't move based on taxes. It's just not, it's part of a number of factors, but it's not the only reason, shall we say, that someone would move from one state to another. It's a lot of things. But yeah, I think it's going to be hard, but we have to get this message out that there's a group of us that are struggling. And the way I look at it is, if since 2020, your life has gotten better, you're probably not on my team. If since 2020, your life economically has gotten worse, we're probably on the same team, because that's most of the people that I'm friends with. And even the ones whose jobs, and this was the problem with my restaurant, is we were doing mathematically higher sales, but lower profit. And everything was costing more and more. So we were netting less profit. And I talked to my friends who have gotten promotions, they've gotten better jobs, but the net is their property taxes have gone up. The cost to keep their kids, fed and clothed has gone up. So they're not feeling any wealthier than they were before the promotion. So that's, I think, where we have the source of unity. And, it's really tough because the Democratic Party, getting back to what you were saying a bit earlier about the networking of the party. And this is one of the issues that I've sort of am coming to reality about in terms of the network is I had this idea, or have had this idea where, what the Democrats and the Republicans have, the basic core of their organization is a monthly meeting happening in almost every town in every county in New Hampshire. And that monthly meeting is happening generally in the same place. Maybe it's Zoom, maybe it's a fire department, maybe it's a town, hall building, whatever. But people can show up to that meeting and they know that meeting is going to be the first Monday of the month at 7 p.m. And even if they don't get an Instagram or Facebook invite, if they don't get a text message, they know they can go and there are going to be people there, working towards their goals.
Right.
And so I knew immediately that's what we were going to have to build out to have an effective long-term third party. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And frankly, I've been in the last month more concerned about the rapid escalation of Donald Trump's authoritarianism, particularly deploying military to LA and then again to DC. Those are very big red flags for me in terms of
we're looking at Chicago now too.
Yeah, and on the road to authoritarianism is paved with military occupations of peaceful cities.
Right.
And then also, I thought it was a really huge red flag when they had John Bolton's house was raided. That's love him or hate him, but that is just a crazy thing for the president to be doing with the Department of Justice against one of his public critics. So I have actually been considering, and especially because they don't have a candidate yet, I've actually been considering running as a Democrat in the last week or two, because one, there is no Democrat currently running, and two, I don't know that we have 10 years to build up a functioning third party with the rapid escalation of Trump's authoritarianism. So I'm kind of moving to this point of like everyone who's anti-Trump, and it might come out that it's actually better for me to run as an independent mathematically. I know it sort of feels like this is a weird time to be questioning what party you're running against or running with.
Right.
But ultimately, the filing period is not until June of 2026 is when you file for governor. So up until that point, really no one is technically running. So I have basically been trying to keep all of my options open, and I'm just deeply concerned about the state of the Democratic Party. I mean, and how unpopular they are. And at the same time, I'm concerned that there's so much infighting between, the liberals, the left, the corporate, Democrats, particularly about Gaza, which I totally understand. But I worry that, we can't do anything for really anybody if we're under some sort of totalitarian Republican rule for the next 50 years.
Right.
But the Democrats have got us in the top, and I think it's really important to differentiate between the rank and file people who consider themselves Democrats and the very small group of people at the top who are making bad decisions.
Yes.
And I've had some Democrats. I've made some videos where I'm critical of the Democratic Party, and people will get mad at me who are rank and file. I'm like, look, I'm not really criticizing you. I'm criticizing the elected officials at the top, the senators, the Congress people, and I'm criticizing the leadership because, and it still is so frustrating. I mean, they had an opportunity last week to vote for it was a non-binding resolution. They had a meeting, and the Democrats did to in a non-binding way say that they wanted to stop the flow of weapons to Israel, and they did not want to do that. And I see these different things like that, and then the continued taking the money from AIPAC, which seems to be like really the biggest issue. And a lot of people on the left are saying to the Democrats, like, just stop taking the money from AIPAC. Like we can draw this line and we can win back these people who maybe didn't vote for Kamala in 2024 because of the Gaza protest movement. What are you doing to win them back? And it seems like very little, and
right.
So we're in just such a strange period where the Democrats seem like the only functioning opposition to the Republicans, while at the same time seeming like doing everything that they can to not be popular amongst their supporters. And so it's such a maddeningly frustrating time to be in politics, because you would think that with everything that Donald Trump's doing, the left would be solid, in opposition to him and his authoritarian pushes, but we're not.
Right.
And and so in some ways I want to stay as independent, not even have to get into that mess. But when I look at, and especially thinking about, if, let's say I log into TikTok tomorrow and I post a video about politics and it says this video is flagged. What if I go on Facebook and I make a post and it says this post about Democrats is being taken down? You know what I mean? Like, what if that full sort of surveillance technology is unleashed on us, which we know Peter Thiel, Palantir, these groups are, they're using that technology right now in Gaza. They've
Right.
now transferred the same technology to ICE that's using this to survey everyone in this country. And if they're able to use that before 2028 and put us in a situation where all of our guerrilla tactics for spreading messages are suddenly, not viable because of their censorship of social media, how do we meet? How do we coordinate? And that's when
Yeah.
the Democratic Party realizing, like, this is because I went to a meeting, Litchfield Dems last week, and that's kind of where it occurred to me, is like, these people know to come to this fire station every Monday or whatever it is, and they'll come even if their phones didn't work. If like all the power was shut off, they would probably know to come here and coordinate and like figure out what the next move is.
Right.
Um, and there's just no other apparatus that exists. There's no other network of people that would exist in a world where we couldn't communicate via social media. So, like, that's just something that I've kind of been coming to grips with, and wanting to be part of the solution, as opposed to, part of the division on the left. So
Sure.
it's this is kind of like been this ongoing struggle since from the last time I wanted to run as an independent in 2024,
Yeah.
because I'm just an independent person. I don't like being constrained by the group think, and I generally think a lot of people in New Hampshire are in the same world as me. The problem is that people are just so programmed into the two-party system that, and the people that I'm worried about, or not worried about, but who I think are going to vote Democrat no matter what, is these people who are checked out, right? They haven't been watching the news. They don't know. They're not mad at the Democratic Party because they're not even watching the news. And when they walk into that ballot booth, they're going to vote for Democrats, no problem, no matter what. You know what I mean? And and then it's going to come down to the people who don't show up. And this is really one thing that I don't think we talk about enough in politics, is the elections are not always decided by who votes. It's often who doesn't vote and who chooses to stay home. And will the Republicans stay home because, let's say, the economy is really bad because of the tariffs? Or will they vote for a Democrat? Or will they just continue to support Republicans? Um,
Right. I
because,
something
like,
I want to sort of like have an insert here because I think there's something to address, and this is something that I really think about a lot, and I think is sort of radioactive for a lot of political. You mentioned sort of like the arms and sort of like weapon tech industry, right? Something that people don't like to talk about in politics is especially in this state, is the fact that some of the biggest contractors that supply arms, not just to the US military, but globally speaking, are housed right here in this state. You've got L3 Harris, you've got BAE Systems, you've got Sig Sauer, right? These are people that have contracts with the DoD. And the sort of other side of that is that you have Jean Shaheen, who sits on the Armed Services, Foreign Relations, and Appropriations committees, right? Now, she can go down to Washington, she can secure contracts for these companies, come back and say, oh, we're doing really well for jobs in New Hampshire, right? So you're then sort of capturing these workers to think like, oh, well, these are good jobs that we really need to have in the state, so it's good that this is happening. But meanwhile, New Hampshire workers are functionally building the weapons that are killing children overseas, and they're making somewhere between like 40 to 60,000 a year. You're talking about like the assembly line workers.
Yeah.
Where you're talking about a multi-million, if not billion-dollar, like several billion-dollar industry, where most of that money is going straight to the top, right? And then you look at polling numbers, and you will see that Jean Shaheen and Maggie Hassan sit right under John Fetterman in terms of the number of bills that they've sponsored that are Trump bills, right? So they have a D next to their name, but functionally they're not really doing that much when it comes to like really towing a Democratic Party line that supports the working class in a fundamental way. She's not out here advocating for the profits that companies like L3 Harris or BAE or Sig Sauer are making to go to increase the wages of their workers. So there's a bit of capture there. Now, those wages are just high enough that these people are able to sort of barely fit into that 30% of your income line on their housing.
Yeah.
So it's a very tenuous position for those workers, and they don't necessarily feel like it's something they can do to criticize or argue against, because they're, again, to go back to sort of the earlier discussion, looking out for themselves, right? They're very concerned because the economy is in a very sort of tenuous state. So it's like that's something that I don't think politicians and party officials and people in general in this state want to reckon with. And I want to sort of take a moment to have somebody who's in politics actually react to this sort of dynamic that exists.
Yeah, it's sort of a terrible, sort of disturbing truth to realize that the brilliance of the military-industrial complex is that they spread their facilities all over the country to every little nook and cranny of this state, of this country, to ensure that every senator is going to vote for every defense budget because of the jobs, and I have been thinking about this for a while, especially, because you look at BAE Systems or SIG or whatever, and they're making all this money. And one of the issues is that they are, in fact, paying a lot of taxes in New Hampshire as well. And they could definitely pay more, but a certain chunk of our Department of Health and Human Services budget is funded by the sales of weapons to foreign countries through taxation, right? So
Right.
there's ways in which we are all benefiting from the war industry, and getting that system out it's like a cancer, right? And it's like, if you do it in the wrong way, you kill the patient, because I mean, it's not a huge chunk of the economy that's relying on the military industrial complex, but for parts of New Hampshire, it's a huge employer, such as Sig Sauer,
Right.
that's close to where I'm at. So I know a lot of people that work there. And this is what I think is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, and it might even be shorter than that. And it's going to make this entire conversation completely different. And that is, as robots and AI take over, and automation, particularly automation, take over a lot of these factory jobs at SIG, assembling guns. I mean, I saw a video last night about, for $5,000, you can buy this little digital arm that will assemble, like an iPhone. And
Right.
it was so cheap, and I'm like, this is going to put so many people out of jobs. And
Yeah.
what's going to happen is we're going to end up in this position where the Congress, the senators, aren't going to be able to say, hey, we're bringing all this money for all these jobs in New Hampshire, because those jobs are going to go into robots, right? And then our relationship to the military industrial complex is going to completely change, in which they will not be providing for us, the average worker, anything, at a certain point. And it's so important, I think, for people to realize that as long as people can profit off of war, there will never be peace. They will find ways, and this is what really scares me in our world, is what's happening behind the behind the curtain. And you hear about Ukraine, and they're talking about a ceasefire deal, and then something happens. And in the back of my head, the conspiracy theorist in me is always thinking, did some military industrial company send an email to somebody at the State Department and say, hey, we're not quite ready for a ceasefire. We've got some more ammunition we've got to sell. We've got some more fighters that we want to get off of our shelves. So, like, can we just keep this war going another 6 months? It'll be great for your donors. It'll be great for your the people working on the military equipment in your town or your city. So let's just keep this thing going a little bit longer. That's terrifying to me. So I think, and this is like a really big idea, but I think we have got to, for the sake of the earth and the sake of humanity, move away from the industry, the economy of war, right? As a state and as a country and as a globe. And in my opinion, the way to move that technology is into space exploration. Frankly, I think we need to
Sure.
turn the industries of war that have actually bred us a lot of technology. A lot of technology we have is because of the military industrial complex. So there
Right.
is kind of this capitalistic, benefit from that. But at the same time, we reach this point where the technology is getting dangerously good at identifying people from satellite in space, and we really need to have a goal as to how this technology is going to bring us to peace. And we have to, in our heads, be able to comprehend that world peace must be possible. A lot of people will disagree with that. They're like, "No, we'll never have world peace." If you continue to say that, there will never be world peace. But we've got to think that has to happen, because the alternative to world peace is world war. And it just, that seems inevitable, that there will be continuous war with this profit motive behind it.
Right.
And I think that really needs to be something that everyone is thinking about and focusing on. And I think that if there's any good to come of what's happening in Gaza, it's that people are starting to see this connection between the military-industrial complex, Israel, what they're doing with the people in Gaza, and how that's now coming home to roost with the technology coming to ICE, and that there's this bigger sort of unseen force. I mean, in a way, I think this is one thing that I agree with some on the right, that there is kind of a deep state, but it's not really that hidden. It's the military industrial
Sure.
complex through the campaign finance system, and it's right there in the open. If you just look at it, you go, okay, these guys paid to get these people elected. These people voted for this war to make sure that these guys got paid. Like, it's pretty simple. It's right there. It's all in the
Right.
filings. So we just really have to wrap our head around the idea that a better world is possible, and I firmly believe that, and that perpetual war is not good and is not sustainable, and that energy, in my mind, would be better spent trying to get off of Earth. Because I think, and this is what I think a lot, some people have realized, I think Elon Musk realizes this, is that no matter what we do, Earth's time is finite, and
Right.
it maybe it's a million years or whatever, but like at
Yeah, if
some
we
point,
don't kill it, eventually the sun's gonna swallow it anyways.
right. So like we need to get off of this rock, and we need to get out into the solar system and explore the galaxies for all the Star Trek reasons. And I think that if we could get humanity globally to see that as a much better goal than perpetual war, we would not be in this situation of having to decide between, economic growth and ending the military industrial complex.
Sure, yeah, exactly. All right,
And
so
yeah,
yeah, so we've sort I'm grateful for your response. I want to sort of, like, in the limited time we have left, I want to sort of take a moment to pivot to something that's probably a lot more material for people, which is the housing question in the
yeah,
state. So I, generally speaking, I think, like, there's a lot of debate and friction between sort of like NIMBY and YIMBY, right? And this idea of sort of like the preservation of the way things are versus the ability to create enough space for people to live equitably, right? Now, I know that you've advocated sort of for like tiny home development and stuff like that. My question to you is sort of like, well, actually, it's sort of a few things. One, something that gets talked about a lot is sort of like the walkability of communities, right? You want to talk about sort of reducing the reliance on cars. You've talked about wanting to go for public transportation. So sort of a few points here. One is, what are your feelings on building upward? I know that we have a lot of sort of resistance to this concept of high rises or larger buildings, but realistically, that's actually the functionally best mechanism to create more housing because it sort of reduces the footprint. So we don't continue to deal with a sprawl, as it were, and you're just able to pack more into less. And like I think there was a debate that occurred, I believe, on Pod Save America recently, where there was a state senator from California was talking to a city councilwoman from LA, and she was being sort of very resistant to the idea of building new housing. And there was this notion of like, well, if it's not perfect, then we don't want it. And eventually you have to kind of realize that like nobody's ever going to be fully pleased. And so there's this aspect of does it really make sense to be moving in sort of smaller individualized housing versus just like more apartment buildings, really? So there's that component, right? We have to address this idea of zoning, and I think that there's something to be said for that argument that's happening out in California right now, is the way it would map on to New Hampshire, in this notion of like having to sort of interject into the local controls over zoning and construction and have sort of a statewide mandate that says no, eventually you just have to sort of suck it up and deal with it, and you have to build more if you actually want to stay alive. So there's that component. And then there's the broader question of actually paying for it. A lot of people, the sort of abundance agenda loves to talk about like, oh, well, it's just restrictions and in terms of funding, and how are you going to, allow contractors and developers to build more and so on and so forth. And I think that exists in that's you're sort of trying to trim fat around the edges without dealing with the real meat of the problem, which is the fact that there's simply not you're not removing the commodification of shelter, right? You're not addressing the fact that you are trying to make a profit. You are trying to build like um sort of generational wealth off of a need to have a roof over your head. And right now we're looking at sort of an attempt by, nationally speaking, on the part of the Trump administration to essentially criminalize homelessness, right? So there's this weird sort of impulse that like, oh, if we just have make the market a little bit more free, that it'll simply solve the problem. And I personally, from my perspective, I don't agree with that. And I think that one of the best ways to sort of solve the problem is to directly subsidize, right? If the government comes in and actually literally foots the bill in part, or maybe in some cases in whole, to either create new housing or subsidize rents, what have you, that fundamentally relieves a lot of the pressure on the people that are trying to find housing. Now, like, as much as I totally see and a sort of short-term need for people who are unhoused to have a campground that they can go to that's safe and secure, so that they're able to sort of like find a spot of respite, the real solution to homelessness is to provide homes, and to put people in those homes. Now, if those people are not able to get jobs, because you need an address in order to work, you actually, if you're going to sign someone's W-2, you have to tell them where you're receiving your mail, right? And if you don't have a home, then you can't get a job. So you need to be able to put people into those homes. Now, if they don't have that job to start out with, then they can't get, like or if they don't have the home, they can't get the job. And if they can't get the job, they can't get the home. So you have this vicious cycle. So at some point or another, there has to be, in at least from my perspective, there has to be a acknowledgement that there needs to be tax dollars that go into funding this. Now, this gets to a broader question of, well, where do those tax dollars come from, right? Something you've mentioned is your willingness to have a discussion about additional or supplemental broad-based tax solutions in the state of New Hampshire, whether it's a sales tax or an income tax. Now, personally, I'm not for a sales tax because that's still regressive and it still punishes the people on the low end of the income spectrum, right? The way I like to explain that is like, if I have to pay a sales tax on something, if I'm making $4,000 a month and somebody else is making, I don't know, $40,000 a month, the portion of my money that goes to buy that carton of eggs or whatever, right, is significantly higher than the person who's making 40,000. So that's still punishing the lower classes, whereas if you have something like an income tax, it's just a flat percentage coming out of your paycheck, right? Again, if you're on W2, you're probably not even thinking about it that much because that money comes out before you even get your check written to you. So it's sort of out of your line of view. So there's my position on that is sort of the income tax really is the more equitable solution to the problem. People really cringe and get sort of like bodily, like, that really gets people's
Yeah.
cortisol running when they hear the concept of income tax. It's like, you're taking my money. But there, I also feel that there's a worthwhile moment to talk about sort of what is a regressive tax in of itself. So I know that I've sort of asked like 8 different questions here, um,
Let's
but
go.
they,
I think I got him. I think I got him right here.
yeah,
So I'll work backwards. I totally agree with you about regressive versus progressive taxes. And it's something a lot of people do not understand. And it's really important for people to understand that at the end of the day, the question is how much of your total income is going towards taxation. Um, and with property taxes, I did the math. I made a spreadsheet for the whole state and compared the average property tax bill in terms of what was going towards public education to the average income. And it's very clear from the data that the more money you make, the chances are you pay less towards, as a percentage of your income, towards public education. And if you make, I think it was over $100,000, you're most likely to pay in the bottom half of property taxes. So it's clear that our system of taxation right now is regressive. With the poorer towns are paying the most of their income, the richer towns are paying the least. I mean, if you go and look, there's someone who's running for CD1. I won't say her name. She has a house in Newcastle. It's worth $3.5 million. Her taxes are $6,000 a year. My taxes for my 1,400 square foot house in Newmarket that's worth probably $400,000 is $8,000 a year. So right there, you can see these discrepancies
right,
from town to town. Now, my idea with taxation is that I don't want to prescribe the solution. And the reason I don't want to is that we've had a couple of solutions brought forward as ways to fund education. Statewide education property tax was basically what they settled with. It didn't really work out because the donor towns didn't want to pay it, so now they keep it. But my point is that I want to have a series of forums around the state and come to a conclusion as to what is the best tax to go forward with. And in the meantime, there's some little things we can do to raise revenue, such as if we go back to the business profit taxes that we were raising or the levels that we're raising in 2015, 2016, that would raise $100 million a year. For instance, like rooms and meals was dropped from 9 to 8.5%, which is really not a lot of money for any one restaurant, but on the aggregate is tens of millions of dollars. Obviously, we could legalize cannabis to bring in some more revenue. And then I really want to get into taxing wealth as opposed to income. And the reason that I want to do that, or that is my preferred method, and figuring that out is a little bit tricky, obviously. But like we had a really good tax. The interest and dividends tax only hit people that were making over, I think it was $250,000 a year, most of them. And that was a really good wealth, tax on the rich because it was, interest and dividends on investments. It was a good tax for New Hampshire. And it was bringing in $100+ million a year. So we could bring that one back. But the issue I have with an income tax is that going forward, as I said before, robots, AI, automation are going to be taking more jobs, right? So more and
right.
more people are not going to have an income. And same with a sales tax. If 30% of the population in a decade is unemployed, they're not going to be having any money to buy anything. Like we're going to have to completely restructure our entire thought process about what the government does and how it does it, because otherwise 30-40% of the population is going to be unemployed in the next 10 years. And I think most people just really cannot grasp how cataclysmic that change is going to be. And getting back to the idea of state funded housing, we're going to have to do that. There's not going to be an option for not doing that. And like right now, our New Hampshire Housing Authority does a pretty good job of creating housing for people with low incomes. Portsmouth in particular has built like 1,000+ units. They've done a pretty good job, and I think that that's a formula that we can work on. I'm not entirely, you know, I'm not stuck on one form of housing. You know, tiny houses is one idea, but I think that the trick is we're going to need to present every town with a lot of ideas in every city and say, these are the ideas. You know, if you don't want the housing over here, because and this has happened in Durham where they didn't want to put a they didn't want to allow a development in because the land was really good agricultural land, and they said
Sure.
we should save this. And I was like, well, it's not really being used for a farm. Like if you have good agricultural
Yeah.
land, we should require that to be used as a farm if it's not going to be housing. And if not here, where? And to
Right.
your point, maybe it would be better to build a 6-story building in Durham that would house 30 people or 40 people as opposed to building a 40-acre, development that's going to be taking up a lot more space,
Right.
especially as the baby boomers are going to be in need of, different type of housing. 80% of baby boomers are living in houses that they will not be able to retire in, but they're sort of stuck in them because of the interest rates.
Right.
And this is a really complex problem that I frankly am not going to say I have the perfect solutions for, but behind me there's an old Catholic school that it's a lovely brick building, and it houses probably 30 or 40 people. It doesn't take up very much space, and it's fundamentally it's a pretty building. Like it's
Right.
not architecturally ugly. And one frustrating thing about the whole downtown of Newmarket is that based on current zoning laws, you could not build any of the houses that or any of the buildings that are here because they're too close to the road. They don't have, I think it's maybe you need 5 feet on either side. And all the
Gotta love
buildings
those
are.
setbacks.
And so I think just having some, like one simple idea zoning wise would be whatever the highest building in your downtown right now should be the height limit, and there should not
Okay.
even be a
Yeah.
question of that. And um and for some towns, it's this is why I like the tiny house idea, because if you can put a tiny house in someone's backyard like an ADU, you haven't had to duplicate services. You don't have to
Right.
put in another water pipe or another sewage pipe. You can connect the existing infrastructure. And the other thing that we've got to keep in mind is that we've got a housing problem for the next 10 to 20 years. And then by 2040, the population of New Hampshire, if we don't, it starts to go down. So we could very easily, and this is, I think, a valid, I don't think this is the argument the NIMBYs are making, but I think it is a valid argument, which is let's not build a bunch of ugly housing that we're not going to need in 10 or 20 years. Let's build the housing that we need, which I used to be against these like 50 plus buildings because I'm like, why are we building more housing for 50 plus? But if the people in New Hampshire are moving from their 2,000 square foot 3-bedroom to a 50 plus community, and that house is now for sale for a family, that's the flow that we need to have that we're not having now.
Right.
And I think one thing that's also important to note is I've been looking for a house for God, like 7 years. I live in this apartment, above my restaurant. I live in downtown, but me and my girlfriend looking for a house. She wants more kids, blah, blah. I will say in the last 3 months or even like 6 weeks, I've seen more affordable housing in my area than I haven't seen since 2019. There's 3
Interesting.
houses right now that are less than an hour from me in New Hampshire, like 40 minutes away, that are under 300,000. I don't even want to tell you where they are because otherwise they're going to get sold
Yeah,
before I
they
can get.
get snatched up right quick.
And these aren't ugly houses. They're not trailers. They're like decent. They're small lots,
Right.
1,200 square foot, 1,400 square foot. But I'm kind of thinking that we're the housing market is crashing in other parts of the country.
Right.
And it was funny because I said to my girlfriend, because I'm looking at the news and I'm like, oh wow, Florida's housing prices are like basically cratering for a number of reasons, like overdevelopment, but also they're having trouble getting insurance and all these different things.
Yep.
And it was funny because my sister, I was talking to her last night, and she said 2 of our son's classmates from last year both moved to Florida during the summer. And I was like, I wonder if they found a house for like $250 in Cape Coral, and we're like, screw it, let's move down there. And so I think we're in a little bit of a fluctuation period with the housing, but I think fundamentally that the government should always be making a priority of housing. And one thing I found out with my research was before, in the lead up to World War I, the United States created, I think it was like the United States Housing Corporation,
Hmm.
because they needed a bunch of housing around these factories that were building the munitions for World War One.
Right.
And so they built these beautiful neighborhoods and just architecturally brilliant. You know, they had the best people doing it. And so it's not unprecedented for the state to be building housing. And, you know, in terms of the homeless, I think that we need like immediate emergency intervention, such as, like I said, state sanctioned camping or even state sanctioned RV parking, I think would be really
Sure.
big because you've got an RV, you've got a bunch of them for, you go on Craigslist, you can buy, you know, there's tons of RVs for really cheap. If you could get those hooked up to food and or water and sewage, you know, you could put those in a parking lot, bam, you've now got housing for 20 people for like very little money.
Right.
Now, again, this is not a permanent solution. I would like to see more single room occupancies built. You know, when I was in Manchester, in my campaign office last time I was in Manchester, and we were paying $400 for a decent sized room in an
Hmm.
office building, and there was really no one else on our floor. There was a few people, but it was pretty empty. But it had a couple bathrooms in it, and at one point, somebody that was homeless, I think, knew about, just figured out that they could go in there and there was a bathroom, and they were sleeping in one of the office spaces. And I was like, you know, better him sleeping there. There's a bathroom, you know, like
Right.
if you had
Yeah.
a communal kitchen in one of these office spaces, you could have 20 people living here for probably like $5,000 a month, you know? And
Right.
we were talking to the homeless people that were living in Veterans Park. And like one of the things I think that people need to realize too is there's really like a couple different types of people that are living unhoused. And there's one type who's been out there for maybe a decade, maybe longer. And they might have some substance abuse issues that they basically have acquired from being homeless. It's not like they were doing meth and then became homeless. It was like they became homeless because of a medical injury and then figured out, hey, if you smoke meth at night, you won't go to sleep and no one can steal your stuff. And I heard
Right.
that story a lot. And then there's people out there who's maybe 65, somebody's grandpa, and the rent just got too high. Their family doesn't live around here, and they don't have a substance abuse problem, and they could be put into housing tomorrow and be fine. But there's other people who have been living on the streets so long that they will get into housing and sometimes literally just leave because they miss the community that they had of living with 20 or 30 people in a tent
Yeah.
village. And this is kind of something that dawned on me is people living in tents is what we did for thousands and thousands of years in groups in tents. And I think some of these people are finding that that community they cannot replicate in a single room apartment. And maybe the smarter thing to do would be to go to a community. And like I talked to this group of people, it was probably 30 or 40 guys. Some of them were even working, but you know, they're doing a lot of sitting around drinking in the park because they had nothing else to do. Most of them had some sort of physical injury or a lot of them were veterans or whatever. But there was a couple of them that were kind of like running the show a little bit. You know,
Yeah.
they would keep an eye on everybody and they'd be like, hey, somebody watch that guy's stuff. He's going to the bathroom. Oh, Tommy's going to go buy cigs. Here's some money, Tom, you know? And if
Sure.
you could find those people and like, be like, look, we want to bring your whole community into this apartment building or, you know, into this little tent village we're going to make, or even, you know, yurt village we're going to make so that you guys are still together and you can watch
You're
out for each
functionally
other.
raising the quality of life for that group of people that would just be there. It's like they've established a community for themselves, and if you just give them a better space or infrastructure, that it's not like they won't leave that space because they miss their community. That's the idea.
Right. And then if you say to them, hey, look, if you guys can police yourselves, you know, in the terms of like keeping the place clean and like, and then you sort of have to have, and this is kind of funny thing that happened in Manchester is all the alcoholics are in one park and all the drug addicts are in a different park because they don't get along, which is
Yeah.
kind of an interesting idea. They've chosen to self select away from each other, probably because they just get in fights otherwise.
Sure.
But if then you could keep basically you're going to have some places that are going to be substance free and some places that are not, because obviously if someone's trying to get off of whatever drugs, they need to be away from people that are doing drugs. But you're going to have people that are doing drugs, so they need to be given space and sort of say like, you know, here's the resources, but like, you know, we can help you get off of your opioid addiction, but you still need to be housed in the meantime. And I think the argument to be made there, and this is what's so important, is like, I think frequently Democrats want to make these humanitarian arguments about everything. oh, we've got to save the homeless people because we're good people and blah blah. The Republicans don't give a shit about that argument. But what does make sense to the Republicans is it doesn't make fiscal sense what you're doing. When we
Right.
have to send the fire department out there, we have to send the ambulance out there, when these people are making our parks so we physically don't want to go in them. Like, why have we just seeded parks? Just given up on the parks in Manchester, as opposed to saying, let's help these people find housing so that we can enjoy our parks again. It's there's a fiscal. There was a study in Phoenix, Arizona. This was several years ago, where they figured out that there was basically 10 chronically homeless people in Phoenix that were costing the city millions of dollars in just ER visits. There was one guy that had cost the city $1 million because he'd get drunk, he'd fall over, whatever, he'd be out in the elements. And they figured out, hey, if we house these 20 or 30 people and just have a nurse that's going to check on them once a week, a social worker is going to knock on the door, every
It
couple of
just
days,
straight up costs less.
it just costs less. You know
It
what
just
I
costs
mean?
less.
And,
Yeah.
and so that's what the argument I always try to make, because the Democrats preach to the choir, and I want to preach to the Republican leaning independent and say, hey, this thing that's also good for the economy, or sorry, this thing that's good for the environment or good for someone's health and welfare is also good for your bottom line. And so let's pursue that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm actually running out of time here, so unfortunately, we're gonna have to call it
That was
for
great.
today. I mean, I could keep going with you on a whole
I
bunch of
know.
different things for a while, but John, it was a real pleasure to have you on today, and I'm
Hey, thank you so
really
much. I really appreciate it.
yeah, of course. I'm glad that you were able to sort of entertain some of my more pointy questions here, because I know some of this stuff gets a little radioactive for political candidates and people that are trying to put themselves out there. So, yeah, significant appreciation on my part for your willingness to sort of engage.
Thank you. It's been fun. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. I will catch up with you soon, I hope. And yeah, so thank you so much.
All right. I'll see you.
Take care. And that's been Jon Kiper. Candidate for governor. He's thinking about whether or not he wants to stay independent or go Democratic, as we just heard. But it's it is something to sort of look at, and I think he's got some interesting perspectives, and he's taken a new approach that is worth considering for folks. So if you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe to the channel. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/locally sourced. And that's been it for today. We'll catch up with you guys next time. Thanks so much.